I'm Brodor, and this is Why We Game. My guest today is Dan Repperger. He would be the #1 original host of the popular podcast Fear the Boot. I think this was your thing, right?
Yeah, Chad was there from the start, but yeah, this came from my mind. Now, I've got to give credit where credit is due. You can't do something for over 14 years and not have it evolve. And of course, how it evolves is oftentimes driven by the people you're doing it with. I may have created it, but if I'm the mother that gave birth to it, there are other hosts that are like all the people this child met and was mentored by along the way. So I don't think I could be so reductionist as to say that it's my show. At least certainly not in its current form. But yeah, the gist of, hey, let's do this roundtable podcast on tabletop gaming. We're not going to talk about politics or religion. And these are the things we're never going to engage in, like native advertising, things like that. Those original parameters that kind of lined up the shot, those were all mine, or at least mostly mine.
I want to put a pin in that, being an apolitical podcast in today's environment. And I don't want to back you into a corner.
Oh, you're not going to.
But I want to set that aside for now, because what I like to do is I like to sort of go as best I can in chronological order, and maybe I'll jump back and do some flashbacks. I want to learn about Dan Repperger. Now you're my buddy and we hang out and we game together, and you have me on Fear the Boot as a host, but there's a lot that I don't know about you as a gamer and how gaming influenced your pursuits to become a professional in the game industry. Now, whether that's as podcaster or writer, we'll get into all that, but let's talk about you. You're in your early 40s, right? So you are on that tail end of satanic panic era of gaming.
Sure. Yeah.
So you grew up in that fabled time of gaming being something that you keep on the down low, that people are ostracized for, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
What was the game that really hooked you? I assume it's going to be Dungeons and Dragons, but I might be wrong.
I don't think that's the right place to start. And by that, I don't mean Dungeons and Dragons. I mean gaming in general.
Okay.
Because all gaming did was give order to something I was already doing. From being a very, very young child, I was always a storyteller. When we played with Transformers or G.I. Joe or whatever, I mean, kids kind of amalgam their toys into somehow a consistent multiverse, where the big stuffed bear and the G.I. Joes and the Transformers and the toy car that's not a Transformer, somehow they all fit together.
Right, you developed a headcanon for all of these action figures.
Exactly. And they all had, there was personality to them. I mean, it's going to be at the level you'd expect from a little child, but nonetheless, they did have personality to them. They had ongoing narrative. There were supervillains or major villains that I would create either from another toy or sometimes just from doodling around. And my brother would sometimes get in on this too, as would my sisters, where they would sort of add to the canon or come up with their own ideas. But that was always there. All that role-playing games changed was it added dispute mechanics or structure, right, to it. So instead of just saying, well, He-Man beats up the Centurion, for anyone who remembers what the Centurions were, I'm not talking about Battlestar Galactica. There were 3 of them. There was a water guy, an air guy, and a land guy, and then they had a couple villains. But it went from just decision, or what we would now call fiat GMing, to now there were dice and there were limits upon the storyteller, and there were mechanisms in place to keep things fair for the participant. So you didn't have to all agree on the story, which is one of the traits that's true of childhood storytelling. If you don't want to fight, and I actually got along very well with my siblings, that sort of generic sibling rivalry of we hate each other but we love each other, that was never there. I mean, it really wasn't. I mean, we had our moments, but 99% of the time, we all got along very well. And so we would tell these stories, and then I get introduced to gaming. First, Chad and one other guy showed me D&D. They didn't show me the game itself, but I would flip through their Dragon magazines and things like that, and they would tell me some of the stories of their games, and I was very, very intrigued by it. That whole thing sounded so fascinating. And when I would take this home or contemplate on it, it wasn't just my parents. I mean, my parents certainly did have a veto on this, but I hadn't fully developed my critical thinking skills, so I was fairly bought into the satanic panic that, D&D was this thing of, witchcraft and Satanism and all this crazy stuff. When I say witchcraft, I don't mean like, Wicca or neo-paganism. I mean like, satanic witchery, Salem witch trial, sort of the devil's brides. I mean, that was that kind of...
Infants crucified on X's and...
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I'm not... So if you're a neo-pagan listening to this, I'm not talking about your jam. I'm talking about something much worse. And I was kind of bought into that and had some debates with them and pretty quickly realized I couldn't back up anything I was saying, which at that point started to kind of bring me around that, I've been hearing all these things at church from my parents, from various little pamphlets I'd been given, and yet none of this was lining up with reality. But even once I had broken past that, I knew there was no way that my parents were ever going to allow D&D in the house. But we ended up getting a FASA catalog that was stuck in with a video game called the Crescent Hawks Inception, which is a BattleTech game. And in flipping through it, and by the way, I think FASA had the best catalogs that ever existed in gaming. I have never seen past or present gaming catalogs that I think were as nice or as attractive as the ones that FASA had. I think that's something any game company could stand to learn from, is dig up these old late 80s, early 90s FASA catalogs and look at how they were put together. But in looking through those, at the time, they had the license to Star Trek. Well, my dad was a big sci-fi nerd back in like the 50s and 60s, the zipper suits, the Forbidden Planet, the original Day the Earth Stood Still, 1960s OG Trek. So I grew up with that stuff as well. So I've always liked it as well. And I showed them this catalog and asked if for Christmas one year, in fact, it was either 87 or 88, if I could get the FASA Deluxe Starter box set, which had the rules for playing characters, had a GM's handbook for like creating planets and encounters, and then it also had all the stuff for ship combat. The ship combat is something that I still run fairly often to this day, especially at conventions. And that was the first actual role-playing game I owned. And I played that for some time before bouncing over to Shadowrun. And then it was from Shadowrun that I bounced over to BattleTech. And if I'm remembering the order of things right, D&D was the fourth game I played. And it was a couple years in. And I don't remember where I got them. I'm sure I saved up my own money or something, but got some of the base D&D second edition book.
So you did not steal these books from Walden Books? Or
No.
Or a bookstore, like how I started developing my role-playing book collection as a child is
thievery?
Yes, thievery.
No.
I mean, I'm not proud of that. I'm just saying that I know a lot of people from my generation that's how they got D&D books, is they fucking ripped them off from a bookstore.
No, none of them were ill-gotten gains. Now, I did though still have to hide them, because it was not until years later.
So just paint me a picture. Dan's room as a kid, he's got his Star Trek books, his BattleTech books, but anything that you have for D&D, that has to be hidden.
It's under the mattress. You see, where most kids were hiding porn under the mattress, I was hiding D&D books. And then some years later, I was hiding an AK. But If you ever looked under my mattress, you would never find the generic things you'd expect to find from a teenager or then eventually a young adult hidden there. It was D&D books originally.
Which, could you imagine, right? So your mom comes in to clean your room and she sees all your regular sci-fi, totally okay role-playing game books, and then under your bed hidden, she doesn't find pornography, but she finds a monster manual and a player's handbook and a dungeon master's guide.
Yeah.
How fucking freaked out would they be?
Oh, hugely. I think they would have preferred to find porn. Because the one time I actually did have anything approaching porn in my room, which was like, it was like a Victoria's Secret catalog or a Fredericks of Hollywood catalog or, like the...
Oh, that was Fredericks of Hollywood. That's when shit got risque.
Oh, yeah.
That's the first time I saw crotchless panties and I was like, what is this?
Well, or even it might have just been the lingerie section of the Sears catalog. For anyone who's old enough, you remember that.
Oh, I do.
If you're male and you were that age.
I do. I still have a sock that looks, it's so crusted with ejaculate that it looks like a piece of coral that I got from the ocean.
Yeah.
It's got a weird sort of yellow-brown haze to it, but yeah, it could cut you.
So I never use socks, but I had that, and that, unlike the D&D books, my mom actually did find that. And, she did the worst thing possible. Like, it would have been better if she'd freaked out and grounded me or made me write sentences or some silliness like that. It would have been better. Instead, she was okay with it and had this very comforting mom talk of, I know at your age you get curious about the female body, and if you have any questions, you can always talk to us. And it's like, oh my gosh, just hit me. I mean, I'll go get a baseball bat.
How dare you have a healthy, rational, normal response to my teen sexual curiosity?
Yeah.
You monster.
I think that's even worse. Everyone says the worst thing a parent can say is I'm disappointed.
Yeah.
I think this was worse than I'm disappointed. I think it was more uncomfortable. It was one of the most uncomfortable moments of my life.
Did they call you Dan or Daniel as a kid?
I believe just Dan. I don't remember. Most of my adult life I've gone by Dan.
Now, partially, Dan, it's okay if you want to tug on your little pud. That's perfectly normal.
But I've always gone by Dan in my adult life, but that's because there, in my lifetime, have only been 3 people in the world that are named Daniel Repperger. And one of them is now dead. But one of them was, especially when Fear the Boot first started, he was notably more famous than I am. He was an inventor. He was an electrical engineer. It's my understanding that if you really get down to the nuts and bolts of how most electronics work, and I couldn't name the components. This isn't my area of expertise. My brother probably could. But if you go in today and you buy a cell phone or a desktop or a laptop, that there are going to be components of it that this guy invented. He's older than I am. He's dead now. And I believe was a distant cousin, because anyone with my last name is related to me. It's a made-up last name. It has no specific genealogy beyond a handful of generations back. So anyone with my last name is related to me. And he has a surviving, I believe it's his son, whose name is also Daniel Repperger. So I started going by Dan, because it's what I was using on the podcast, and it separated me from these other 2 individuals.
Well, and it sounds less officious.
Daniel
Repperger sounds very officious.
The only place I'm Daniel Repperger is Facebook, and that's because Dan Repperger was already taken by the younger of the 2 Daniel Reppergers over on that sort of distant-ish side of my family. So that's the only reason that I'm Daniel on Facebook, but everywhere else you go.
See, I just assumed that it was because officiousness makes bitches swoon. Like that was your dating strategy, was to have a very officious name.
No. Well, keep in mind that for 20 years I was with the same woman. There was no dating strategy. Johnny G's always joked when people ask him why he got into podcasting, he always replies for the pussy. And And I mean, if that was really true, we would have a true crimes podcast. We wouldn't have a gaming podcast.
Yeah. So what you're suggesting then is that the True Crimes podcast, that's the avenue to be successful with
the women. Oh yeah. You want to get successful with the women. You got to find out whatever basic bitches are doing, and then you got to follow that. So right now it's true crime, but you could also have like a review show of like, dish about last night's, reality and gossip TV, do water cooler talk for women that just don't have enough other female friends or gay friends or whatever to talk about this stuff. And yeah, that's what but you find out what the basic bitches are doing. And let me tell you, it's not D&D. That day may come because it's getting more and more mainstream with the younger generations. But I don't think I've hit the level of fame where some 25-year-old's going to be throwing herself at me. No, so that was never. It was always other motivations to do the podcast. I think I always just went by Dan just because it does sound, I guess, less officious. It's more casual. It sounds like, I'm not trying to be all stuck up about it. Like, it kind of drives me nuts when I see these people that, first of all, have to have a 3 or 4 part name. Or they've got to have the middle initial in there, or they've got to have a middle name in there, and then their full first name and whatever. And it's just like, oh, come on. But, or the other thing is, and I accept this with Monty Cook because his name is bigger than his products. But for anyone else, if you go out and get like John B. Smith's Dungeon Crawl Adventures, and it's like, oh, fuck off. I mean, who is John B? Right, I'm making this up. Okay, so if there's a John B. Smith who writes games, I apologize. I literally did not know you existed. But that's kind of my point. It's like, oh, come on. What kind of narcissism is this? And I always said that was something I wanted Fear the Boot to be. That's something I want everything I do to be. Skies of Glass, Fear the Boot, whatever, is I want it all to be bigger than me. That sounds perhaps even more arrogant, but let me explain what I mean by that. I don't mean that my products are so awesome that they're going to become cultural icons like Star Wars or something. Now, what I mean, that'd be cool, but that's not a delusion I nurse. But what I mean is that I want the other people that are involved in any way, whether it's as consumers or whether it's as fellow creators on the project, to feel like they own it, they contribute to it, they shape it, such that if tomorrow I got killed in a car crash, I don't know if they would choose to continue it without me, but they would have the ability to. I can go to my own convention. I can go to Fear the Con, and there are people there who have no idea who I am. They know what Fear the Boot is, maybe, but they don't know who I am. And I'm happy. I'm proud of that fact. Because that means I accomplished what I set out to do, which is I made a community, or helped, I shouldn't say I made, that's really not true. Many people made. I set into motion a community, and ideas and products and whatever. How many people now are talking about Session Zero? How many people now are talking about group template?
We're getting into
do you realize
the podcast a little sooner than I intended? But let's dive right in.
Well, yeah, these are things that came from us. If you find a reference to Session Zero that predates Fear the Boot, I don't doubt you will. I'm not going to say the group template we wholly invented. The character worksheet that I've released, so not really pushed as heavily as the group template, that was also our doing. Session Zero, yeah, you might find somebody who mentions it prior to Fear the Boot, but it does not really enter into the gaming mainstream until we come along.
I will say that I was a listener of Fear the Boot before you invited me to be a host, and the group template, I had not been exposed to that concept until I started listening to Fear the Boot.
Yeah, that one we invented whole cloth. The group template started with us. Now, my point with this is not, once again, some arrogance. It's more to say that I know for a fact there are things that we have contributed to the hobby, to the conversations about the hobby, to the way people that approach trying to get the best games that they can. And my point there is I don't care if we're credited or not. I don't care if people trace it back to us or not. What is important to me is that I succeeded at what I said earlier, which is I wanted to create something that was bigger than I am. So much so that if I rebranded it as Dan Repperger's group template, people at this point would probably think that I was trying to own something that was already everybody's idea, which is not the case. But to me, that's mission successful. That's what I wanted to do. And I can't speak, and I'm saying I hear a lot as opposed to we, not because the other hosts didn't contribute, not because the other hosts are not in fact important contributors to what we have accomplished, but only because I don't feel it's fair for me to speak on their behalf. I don't want to say we feel this or whatever because I didn't take any informal polls amongst the hosts before this show. So I'm going to speak purely about myself. But, I fully recognize the podcast, it may have originated in my brain, but it only exists because of the work of many people, of which I am only one.
What inspired you to start the podcast anyway? So this is in the early 2000s. You've been gaming for many years. You had done some professional work for FASA writing. What inspired you to, I'm going to get some recording equipment and I'm going to get my buddies together because we have something to say about RPGs and provide perspective on role-playing game advice?
It was two things. The first thing that I think made my mind a fallow field for something to, grow there was I've always wanted to be a prose writer, and I've done prose writing in a variety of forms, some of which got published, much of which did not, but it's something that I've had as a hobby a long, long time. The first book, and it's childish and awful and all this stuff, was about a group of 3 people that were hunting cryptids. The first book was about them hunting the Loch Ness Monster, and I don't remember what the second one was about, but whatever. And I wrote this as a little kid. And it was fairly long. If you were to put it in type form, it'd probably be a novella. I don't think it'd reach the length of a full novel, but it was the length of a novella. And it was something I never stopped doing. Then come 2002 to 2003. This was back before you really got your best writing advice online. If you wanted to write back then, it's like 90s, 2000s, I guess probably back into the 80s, there was 2 books you wanted. One was the Writer's Handbook. I don't remember the name of the other. But both of them had writing advice and then had large lists of publishers and agents and their submission guidelines. So I picked these up, and starting in 2002, I began work on a novel. Full-length novels, 120,000, 130,000 words. And wrote the whole thing up in what at the time was the desired submission format, and followed all the guidelines that were given for various people in this book. Then got my cover sheet together, got my synopsis ready, all the things that they wanted to see, right? Because you had to have your cover letter introducing yourself, your synopsis of the book, and then it was usually a sample chapter or some number of pages, 10 pages, 15 pages, whatever, of sample writing from the book. In a few cases, they wanted the full manuscript, but not usually. Before I set this off, let me back up a step. I did a lot of editing passes with friends and family members. And I know a lot of people at this point may kind of guffaw and say, oh, why would you go to your friends and family member? Of course, they're going to love whatever you do. No, I went to people in my life that are honest, because I have some brutally honest people in my life, especially when I tell them, don't spare my feelings. You guys are readers. You read a lot of books. I want you to tell me what works and doesn't work in mine. And they gave me at points some pretty harsh feedback. So I got real editing done. They caught grammar errors. There weren't many spelling errors, because I was using a spell check, but in some cases you get a homonym, you get a word pear that you eat versus a pair of pants, it's words that are spelled differently but pronounced the same or whatever, and so they're real words, a spell check wouldn't catch that. They edited a lot of the creative concepts in there. Once again, what worked, what didn't work. So it went through a whole bunch of passes. Anyway, so finally I get these submission packets together, send them off. And at the time, you're supposed to include a self-addressed stamped envelope, and they were then going to usually just give you anywhere between 1 page to maybe half a page of form letter basically saying yes, no, or yes, but it's going into a slush pile, which that means it's a project that they're not ready to get rid of, but they're not interested enough to push now. But like if they're having to sit down with a publisher and they're what they think are their top 5 best submissions the publisher doesn't want, they can take on one of these slush pile projects and see what they can do with that. But anyway, so I got a lot of half-page thanks but no thanks form letters. I got one guy who tried to say your book needs editing and here's an editing service. And by the way, that's a big ethical warning. This is a sign he's probably getting kickbacks from this editing service. This is not a promise to publish. It's actually kind of scummy. But there were a couple people, I submitted to 35 places, and there were 2 or 3 of them that wrote me back notes that all said the same thing, which is, we like what you've got here. We think you've got something good. But the problem is we don't know how to sell it. It was space opera type sci-fi, and they said right now, that's not what's selling. That's not what publishers want. This was vampire romance era. They want vampire romance, maybe, or some other form of urban fantasy, mostly vampire romance. And or they want something from a name that's easily recognizable. And they said, you don't have either. This is not what's popular in the market. It's not what publishers are asking us for. And it's not attached to a name that's big enough to sell the book anyway. Stephen King can write whatever and they'll take it and sell it because it's, Stephen King's name alone will carry the book. So this gets stuck in my mind of, okay, nobody knows who I am. How do I fix that? So I tried some other routes. I tried writing some serial fiction for various publications, and it got published. They liked it. It got approved. It got published. But it never got enough attention to really build anything off of. So then come 2005. My friend's dad, I'm using friend without a name because we're not really friends anymore, but he ran a human resources company, and he hit me up. I was kind of his technical go-to guy, and he's like, Dan, I've been, reading in all my boring ass CEO magazine stuff, which tech people love that because the worst ideas in any company come from some CEO reading a magazine and not understanding the concepts or the context, or probably the magazine didn't understand it. And he's like, it looks like podcasting's the way that things are going. What do you know about podcasts? I said, well, nothing, but let me figure it out. So I go out and got some books, did some reading online, started to learn how to put together a recording setup, all this stuff, and helped this dude with his HR podcast. And let me tell you, I learned several things. One,
you don't put your finger in your employee's butt. That I can tell you that from personal experience, don't do that.
Okay. I'll take your word for that because this was occurring at a different level. It was not like how to survive your Me Too moment. This was more like, how do you motivate employees in a large, it was technically, it was HR, but it's the side of HR they call organizational psychology. It was that side of things. So it wasn't things like here's how not to get sued by being a jackass. It was
right. And this is how, if you want to take your cubicle farm and you want to make sure that psychologically they're oppressed enough to not object to your abuses, this is how you structure
motivated enough that they keep working.
Yes. Well, because they have to eat, right? And you need to remind them that their children are reliant upon their suffering. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it was that level of HR. And I noticed a couple of things. So one, it was boring. Two, despite the fact that it was boring, I was having the time of my life doing it. Like, this wasn't work anymore. He was paying me a little bit of money, but this wasn't work anymore. I was loving this. I just loved this. And I wasn't on the show. I was just helping him produce it.
I had no idea that you had been a producer for somebody else's podcast prior to launching Fear the Booth.
Yeah, that was my first foray. It was not as a host or even a guest on somebody's show. I was the technical and pseudo-creative producer. Now, I say pseudo-creative because of the fact that probably the best feedback I gave him, because of the fact that this was something, I mean, everyone's had these things where you didn't know you were good at it until you attempted it and then found out you're apparently just wired to do this. That like you just naturally sort of get this in a way you don't get the 99% of the rest of your life. You know, like I suck at the visual arts. I've tried being taught whatever and I can't pull it together. But this, like I just got it instantly. I had this intuitive sense of how it works. The guy would record his show on his topic and then afterward, he and the person he was talking to, the minute the mics were dead, they'd have a much more casual conversation that was 1,000 times more personable, more interesting, and more real than anything that was said on the formatted portion of the show. And I even told this guy, I said, you need to start recording this. I said, when you turn the mics off is when your show's starting. I said, you know, this other stuff, it's very rote, it's very formulaic, you know, honestly, it's a bit boring. But the second you cut these mics off and you and the other person just start having real talk about what it's like to be in this industry, now I'm captivated. I actually care about HR. And that says a lot because I hate HR.
Yeah, no, I do. I hate HR too because their function is to protect the company from lawsuit.
Precisely.
It's not about defending the rights of your human resource. It's literally resource. This body is just a body. It's not a person. It's not a human being with needs. It's just a thing that I have to pay, I have to insure, and I have to make sure that it doesn't sue me.
Precisely. Avoid a lawsuit and the managers will tell you how important it is or not to have this person still in the organization. So you will either follow the guidelines or not. When HR tells you that, oh, we can only do so much with your pay or we can only do so much in regard to accommodate situation, one of the most constant lies they tell. They always can do more or less based on whatever they are just feeling motivated to do.
Right. And if the powers that be say we don't care that employees are literally falling asleep at their cubicles day after day after day, we're afraid of a lawsuit, so you may not fire them. I watched that happen twice at a company that I worked for.
Sure. And I've seen simultaneously one person be told, oh, we can only give you a 3.5% raise this year. That's the maximum they're allowing to anybody, blah, blah, blah. Whereas the person next to them in the same position doing the same work is given what amounts to, you know, a 25-50% pay increase. You know, it's total BS. They should go back to their original name, personnel. That is far more of an honest name than HR. But so the point being though that I was like getting fascinated by this. And so I'm like, I want to do a show of my own. First of all, it could help me with the writing thing because I could get that name recognition. In fact, I have had a few mid-level, I mean, no big publishers, Tor hasn't approached me, but I've had some mid-level publishers come to me since I've been doing the podcast and say, hey, would you send us a manuscript? And I write them, it's not an aggressive letter, but a very honest response usually. And I say, based on the email address you're hitting me up at, I'm guessing you found me through the podcast. You know, I'm flattered you want a manuscript, but why? You've never seen my writing. I might write like a 2-year-old. And their response has been,
we don't care.
We don't care.
It's not the quality of the work. I mean, Michael Bay gets butts in seats, right?
Precisely.
It's not about the quality of the work, is that can the work be refined to the point that it is marketable?
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. And
hey, thanks, buddy. I don't actually care, and I know that the listener's probably annoyed, but I love that fucking dog. And
I'll switch him to a rope.
Right on.
That's not squeaky at least. But so I was building that secondary fame. Like I said, I was just loving doing it. So I went and I thought, well, what can I do a podcast on? What do I care about enough that I have enough things to say on it to get a podcast going? I don't think I can do it solo. I already kind of, once again, I just intuitively sort of got this. It's like solo shows aren't going to work. I mean, a handful of people could do them. Someone like Bill Burr, he can do a solo show that's worth listening to for, 45 minutes.
Yeah, stand-up comedians.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big Dan Cummins fan, and he does a show that's just him.
And but most people can't do this. You need other people to riff off of. You need other people to motivate you. You need other people to hold you accountable. You need other people to kind of fill in when you're having a down spell in life or things aren't going so well. You need other people to have ideas you didn't, to critique what you're doing, or also to have additive ideas instead of subtractive ideas. You know, instead of saying you shouldn't do this, to say, you know what? We got to talk about this topic. Like, man, I never even thought about that. Or I get what you're talking about, but I got nothing to say on it. But they do. They got an hour's worth of material to burn on that. So it's like, I need other people. Well, first thing that comes to mind is video games. But I look out there, even back this is now real early 2006. This is still the very early ages of podcasting. I mean, it really depends on what you call a podcast. But, I mean, the first proto-form podcasts probably did not exist, once again, depending on what exactly you're willing to call a podcast, until somewhere between, like, let's say maybe 2002 to 2004. Okay, so the first person trying this for the first time did not occur. It was about 2 years, maybe 4 years prior to that. So this was very nascent. And podcasting didn't take off until the 20-teens. So this was very, very, it was a baby of a hobby. But even then, when I looked at the list of shows, there were much bigger names than I was already doing this, and there wasn't room for me. There was a lot of shows. Because everybody plays video games, right? And so are a lot.
It's much more ubiquitous than tabletop gaming.
Especially at the time. 2006, man, we were a niche within a niche. I mean, we were podcasters within tabletop gaming, and tabletop gaming was not then what it is today in terms of popularity. You don't have kids in schools begging to play a D&D or start a D&D club. This was not happening. The pretty girls were not playing D&D. This was just reality. I'm not trying to be, whatever. This is just this. I'm just telling you the truth.
No, it's just the nature of how the hobbies evolve.
And I think it's evolved for the better in that way. If you had a person of color at your table, it was because they were as much an outcast as you were, except in their cases because they were the one person of color who happened to live in the suburbs. But they were as much of an outcast as you were, right? So it's just a bunch of outcasts doing this thing. With video games, there were big names. I don't know if some of these are even still around, but like 1UP, which was a big name in video gaming at the time. They were already doing this. Penny Arcade, they keep coming and going from their podcast. But at the time, they had a podcast. It was Penny Arcade and like Will Wheaton, and I think it was co-sponsored by folks that do D&D, which I can't remember at the time. That was WotC, or that was still I guess it would have been WotC at that point.
Yeah, because 3rd edition D&D was 2000. And
okay,
that was
so that would have been WotC.
Yeah.
But Penny Arcade's predominantly video games. I mean, WotC was involved in their show a little bit, but it is still predominantly Penny Arcade's. It's video games, right? And it's like, we can't compete with these names. Like in tabletop gaming, a lot fewer shows, and I didn't see any names that intimidated me. That's how we ended up doing a tabletop podcast. And originally it was me, Chad, Tim and Kevin. A guy named Mike was invited. Tim and Kevin thought the whole thing was a joke, and both of them, I think, did 2 episodes each. Not even the same 2 episodes. I think they were both on one, then one was on a second, and then the other was on a second. And then they bounced because they thought it was a joke. I invited a close friend of mine named Mike, but he declined it, and I still have the email he sent me where he described Fear the Boot, and as I quote, a poorly thought out idea that he told me in detail why he believed that no one would ever listen to it and why it was just basically a waste of time. I still have this email because it's like kind of like what I go back to every time I look at my numbers and then I go reread that email.
Yeah.
And it's like, man, you gotta remember if you got a creative thing, man, that you love, sometimes you gotta believe in you because nobody else around you will. Even the people that should be believing in you, they don't always come through to you. Okay, sometimes everyone's telling you it's a bad idea. Maybe you should give it a hard thought. Maybe it is a bad idea.
Yeah, sometimes I'll get stoned and I'll write, and my wife will be like, you need to revisit that sober. You've got some good ideas here, but this is not wise.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, and sometimes all your friends are telling you it's a bad idea because it is a bad idea. Or to quote Chris Rock's, like, you know when people say I wouldn't do that shit if I was you? Well, here's some of that shit.
Yeah, that's a good delivery too. That's a good way of framing it for someone.
And so, but that doesn't mean they're right. They can be wrong, right? You can find tons of people like this. Stephen King, when he started out, nobody believed in him but him. When you look at Jim Davis, who did Garfield, nobody believed in him but him. Nobody. I mean,
shit, today people don't even believe in Garfield. They just read that without Garfield. They just watch Jim be crazy.
Yeah, Garfield minus Garfield. They watch John Arbuckle's.
John, thank you. Yeah.
John Arbuckle's Descent into Madness, which is great. I love Garfield minus Garfield. But the point is, though, that's why I get these people together, right? And I've got this passion. I love doing podcasting. We've got a topic where it's on a field small enough that we can fit. Kevin and Tim bounced on me, but then some other people stepped in. And Chad stayed with me. God bless Chad. He was the one person who stuck with me from the very start, who believed in it from the very start. But then some other people got involved that actually did stick with it. And, there's been host turnover and such. But out of that, that's where Fear the Boot came from.
You did not have a dream where some, fey entity came to you and said, Dan, you have an excellent voice and near perfect diction. You'll be great for radio on the internet. And you just woke up in a cold sweat and then just built this thing.
No.
You and your buddies just got together and said, hey, I want to do a podcast. We know a lot about role-playing games and I think that we could be good at it. And I have a natural affinity for this audio tech and doing a podcast. So screw it. We're gonna plug in some mics, put pen to paper, and we're just gonna make the show. And you've been doing it once a week ever since.
Yeah, I mean, we've missed a few weeks over the past year because I kind of went through a pretty deep funk. I mean, it's no secret at this point that I got divorced, but that kind of put me through a deep funk, and then COVID hit. So our schedule, I guess, over the past year or two has not been as consistent as I would like. But yeah, prior to that, it was almost always once a week. We would maybe miss 1 or 2 weeks a year. We're now doing probably about 2 out of 3 weeks, which is something I want to improve. But I guess we'll have to see because they're now talking COVID's going to go into a second wave or who knows. I don't know. I'm not an expert and I'm not going to pretend to be. The point being that, that's what we've done pretty consistently. And no, in terms of really prior information that I had a knack for language, for speaking, for writing and such, I could only really think of 2 people in my earlier life that encouraged me in that regard. One was a youth pastor where I wrote him a letter when I was going through kind of a rough time as a teenager. And one of the things that he said upon responding, he's like, have you thought about being an author? Because he's like, that letter was like, he said, like, a teenager should not be writing like that. And I don't say to pat myself on the back. This is just what occurred. And I think false humility is as useless as arrogance. But the other one was a junior year, not junior high, but a junior year. So if you're not American, that's the 3rd year of high school. I don't know why that's the junior year, but whatever. 3rd year high school English class. And there were times she wanted poems that were written to an intentionally military cadence read aloud. And she would always ask me to do it, and I'm like, well, but so-and-so over there is like a drum major for the band. He is going to be much better than reading this than I am. And she's like, no, I think you're the person that needs to read it. But that was the only bit of real encouragement I got, with all of this.
Well, it's interesting. Just if you look at audio editing, like when I'm doing audio editing, I can see that when I speak, it's just a long, fat wave of up and down, right? But watching a recording when you do it, there are very clear, flat demarcations between each word. But you do it in a way that it flows naturally. When I talk like that, it sounds very stilted, but you're a natural for it for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what I was saying earlier. Look, I think everyone, and this is, we're talking about me and we're talking about podcasting. But once again, I cannot stress, I don't want this to be a self-referential or arrogant display.
No, this show's about you, Dan Repperger. You fire him up, man.
But the point being that I think everyone out there, at some point in their life, or if you haven't yet, you will, is going to find something they were made for this, and they never knew they were made for this, and they're going to have a level of talent with it that, yes, practice will refine and experience will refine, but there's something about them where they're just naturally put together in a way that makes them good at this. For some people, it's being a parent. For some people, it's encouraging others. For some people, it might be drawing. Maybe they've just always been doodling and they've gone from, cartoon doodles in the corners of their notes in school to now they can draw these really amazing things. It could be a number of things. Maybe your shower voice singing is actually better than you think it is. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what it is. Maybe you're just really good with your kids and your kids just love being around you. You're the best mom, best dad, whatever. Or maybe it is something like writing, but for me it's language. I speak well, I write well, and I'm really good at analyzing language. Like, I can oftentimes pick out lies very quickly because I notice the nuances of the way people say things. Like, that's not the phrasing they would normally use to say this. I start paying more attention or something like that.
It's got to make you quite paranoid.
Oh, it does, because let's quote House, everybody lies. I don't know how personally you want to get here, but that's been kind of a rough thing for me because to me, I think honesty is perhaps the greatest of virtues. I know spiritually it's love, but in terms of interpersonal relationships, I care more about honesty than I do about love. And I'm not going to tell you I've never lied in my life. I have. I will tell you that I don't lie frequently. But yeah, I catch a lot of people around me lying, and given how profoundly I have been betrayed in my life by certain people who made a lifestyle out of lying, that it does set off some alarm bells in me. And it took me some time to kind of get my head around that. I don't believe in such a thing as a white lie, but going back to everybody lies, does this particular lie really mean that this is a bad... There's a difference between telling a lie and being a liar. One's a lifestyle, one's a method of function, whereas the other is just an incidental act. But it took me years to get my head around that people tell lies, but that doesn't mean there's something bigger and evil going on. There may be any number of reasons they told that lie.
Yeah, generally it's to protect themselves from shame and or embarrassment.
Sure. Or could even be... one of the first times I remember doing this was when I was a kid. Chad and Tex, my older brother, went down to rent a videotape. And I really wanted to watch one movie. They really wanted to watch another. And when they got back, they're like, yeah, we looked for your movie, but they didn't have it. And I just got to rolling that around in my head like that. No, I don't buy it. And so I asked my brother sometime later, I said, they had my video and you guys just didn't want to watch it. He says, yeah. But yeah, it does. It makes you paranoid. It's like, man, the time really pissed me off.
There's a couple things that I still want to tackle. First and foremost, you are still an avid gamer.
Yes.
You are still an avid writer. You participate in a number of games. You run some games. You're starting a West Marches campaign.
Yes.
With some friends and family on the internet. But I game with you every other week doing the Fear the Boot Skies of Glass actual play. What is it about gaming that keeps you coming back? I mean, you've been doing this since you were a kid. Storytelling you were doing prior to ever being exposed to actual adjudicated rules, tabletop gaming. But you found gaming and you're still here doing it. You're still running games. You're still writing fresh material all of these decades later. What is it about it that has kept the romance alive over all these years?
Because the romance never changed. Like I said earlier, and like you just repeated, I love storytelling as long as I can remember being capable of telling stories. Well, when I'm sitting there at home writing these detailed narratives, detailed for a kid, I'm sure they'd be cringeworthy and laughable if I actually still had any of the notes I wrote up at school or something. But, writing these narratives as a kid, I mean, you do it partially because you love it. You wouldn't do it if you didn't love it. But a big part of what I loved was taking that home and getting my brother or my sisters excited about the idea and watching them enjoy playing within that sandbox, right? It was watching them enjoy the story. Now, obviously I didn't get famous playing toys with my brother or sisters. Obviously I wasn't pulling in fat checks from, playing toys with my brother or my two sisters. So what was it kept me coming back? Once again, I love storytelling, and I loved watching the investment of other people playing in the sandbox. It's like the artist who, has his stuff up or her stuff up on this temporary display in a gallery, and you just sit there because nobody knows what the artist looks like, and you listen to people talk about how much this one piece really moves them or whatever. You're like, man, something I did touch somebody. I mean, maybe you're not big into the creative arts, but it's just one day, after they get past that rebellious phase of teens, your kids come back in their 20s or whatever, and maybe they start to tell you how much the things you did with them, the times that you were horsey and all that, how much that meant to them. And suddenly you feel that sense of purpose and fulfillment. You feel some kind of depth appear in your life. You feel that meaning, that legacy, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. That's what keeps me going back to it. I don't think you can get burned out on gaming unless you're gaming the exact same style of gaming and the exact same rule system. I mean, if you're doing the same thing over and over, you're going to get burned out on. But gaming is such a diverse thing. Saying you're burned out on gaming is like saying you're burned out on movies or TV shows.
What's the cliche? There are only a set number of plots, and they're just, it's sort of like Mexican food. We have a dozen ingredients, and we're going to make 1,500 different kinds of things with those ingredients. Storytelling's the same way. We have these handful, less than a dozen basic plots, if I recall the number correctly, but we continue to evolve and tell stories using those same simple concepts.
Right. And we mix and mash them, and we chop them up in different ways. But that's effectively the case. But there are a lot of people right now that are really excited about this West Marches game. Now, I've not run even the first session. In fact, I've only done character creation for 4 of 10 players. So, it's not that. It's not that I'm getting some kind of positive feedback loop, but these people are excited, and that's contagious to me.
Well, what's really cool to me about your story that's super encouraging is that you grew up in a household where this was an activity that was questionable, particularly doing fantasy style tabletop gaming. Yes. But now you've got your sister, your brother-in-law, your other brother-in-law, and nephews playing in the game along with Wayne, Johnny G, Julia, me. And so it's interesting that something that years ago was seen as dangerous and inappropriate, that the rest of that a good portion of your family has come around and said, no, this is actually really cool and exciting and interesting, and it's an activity we can do as a family. Maybe we should have listened to Dan all those years ago.
Yeah, and I would add some more family members than that, insofar as if my brother was here and not in Seattle, he and probably at least one of his kids, if not both, would be involved. Even kind of the head of the satanic panic concern within my household. We actually invited my mom and asked her if she wanted to play. She said no, but it was primarily for lack of time. But I sit there, on these family dinner nights. I've got my D&D books with me. And there's my 2 brother-in-laws and my sister asking if they can grab the books and flip through them and, read some things and whatever. And it's no big deal, right? Yeah, people came around. People changed. And I appreciate that. But that's what keeps me coming back to gaming, is gaming never gets old. I'm not out of stories to tell. I still have stories I either want to tell that are brand new or ideas that I tried in the past. They just didn't work out in that context. And I want to retool them and try them again with new people. And then there are always, every game is unique because I get to have stories told to me as much as I tell them. When people give me their character backgrounds or the plot hooks they have in mind, how they're integrated to other characters, they go out into my world and start interacting with it and change it in ways I didn't expect. There's that feedback loop of not just their excitement and their investment, which that alone is a huge motivator to me, But it's also that they're telling a story back to me that I get to go and be surprised and to watch a narrative unfold that, I may have set the ball rolling in terms of I described the first scene, but I didn't script out what happens from there. So stories is as much new to me as it is to them. This is happening also in our Skies of Glass game already.
Something that I certainly want to address is fear the boot and politics. And the reason I bring it up is that in today's day and age, it is very, very difficult to be in a position, as an authority, as an influencer, as someone in the industry. You've got, 15,000 listeners on average per episode. That's a lot of voices that hear your show, but Fear the Boot doesn't take a stance one way or the other, but it seems on political, let's say BLM, for example. And
okay,
I'm not
sure.
trying
right.
to pick,
no, that's fine.
I'm not trying to put Fear the Boot in a box, but what I am saying is that a lot of institutions and organizations are getting backlash because they have not put up a flag, right? They've not said, we support X, therefore this is the camp that we're in. Has there been an outcry or?
No.
No one's, do you think it's because over the years you have never established a foot politically one way or the other and so people just don't expect it? Or?
I think it's a variety of things. That one, the hosts have varying opinions on a lot of these issues. We certainly do not see eye to eye. Politically, we've got very conservative members of the show. We have very liberal members of the show. Religiously, we have Christians of a couple different stripes. We've got atheists. We've got people who are what I would call nominally religious, where they believe there's something out there, but they really haven't defined what it is. They believe there's something like a God out there, but once again, they really haven't given it any definition. We've got, I'm not outing her here, but because we just did a show where she did tarot readings, but we've got one neo-pagan / witch who's, I don't know what her preferred name she would give to her belief system, but on the show, I had somebody on the show who practiced a form of esoteric elementalism, which would take me a while to explain. But this is like old, Renaissance era sort of, or maybe middle to late Middle Ages sort of mysticism. First of all, I don't know that the show would have an opinion on anything. We're diverse people who have diverse views on all kinds of stuff. But the second thing is, yes, we have had a small number of individuals in the past ask us to make a stand on something. My reply to them has always been a firm no, followed by, and if I did speak out, what makes you think it's your opinion I would give? I look at it in a very simple way. Like you said, the show, it varies from show to show. It's hard to get exact counts. Our top show has been like 20, 25 grand. Average on a mature episode is, it runs about 15 grand once it's had enough time to get through the pipe. It takes several weeks to get there. But the way that I responded to this is two things. One is I've said that we were using the term safe space long before it reached the common parlance. And now it means something somewhat different. But we always described Fear the Boot as a big tent and a safe space. Now let me stress, if you're front loading that term with a whole bunch of things about how it's used now on college campuses, this was before that, okay? The phrase meant something different back then. Where we came up with that phrase, or why we used that phrase, was we said that people, they need a break. I've watched people who do nothing but sit there and they watch the news and watch political commentary on YouTube and whatever. And I've watched this happen to every side of every debate. And you know what happens to these people? They go nuts. I'm 100% dead serious. I have watched these people slowly drive themselves insane, where they are screaming like animals on Twitter to 200 or 300 followers that probably don't even read their tweets, because I don't see a single like, retweet, or reply, that we just gotta do this, or stop that, or so-and-so's out of control. And it's like, you're doing nothing. You're probably taking years off your life, because you're stressing yourself out, your blood pressure's through the roof, and you're screaming on issues that, one, you have no control over, apart from what you yourself decide to do. And secondly, you're screaming to people who already have their own opinions anyway. What percentage of my audience do you think is sitting there with no opinions, waiting for me to tell them what to believe and what to do?
I'm going to go with 0.
Yeah, it's going to be some number close to 0. There might be some really small number of people who, for some reason of complete apathy or, I don't know, some kind of mental illness themselves or whatever, maybe really do need me to tell them what to believe. But this is going to be some number approaching 0, which takes me to the safe space idea. So what about the 99 to 100%? What about those people? Well, once again, I actually had to slow down how much I was reading the news, because I used to be very, very avid about keeping up with current events, politics, all that stuff. And that was way before things got half as insane as they are now. You could actually have reasoned debates with people on the internet. Believe me, there really was a day that was true. All right. Yeah, you had your idiots. It was never, but it wasn't as bad back then as it is today. And I still had to unplug from it because, like, this is affecting me. You know, I'm sitting here stressed out, pacing around over things that I didn't do and I can't undo and I can't control. And one of my break moments was I was sitting there on a discussion forum for politics. I said, you know what? The sun is shining, 72 degrees outside. I'm sitting here at my job, making, enough money to pay my bills. I've got family that loves me. And, the world's going to keep on spinning. And there was this one bitch in particular just tore me up one side and down the other for this. Because I just kind of said for a moment, you know what? There's life beyond this. Her phrase to me was something effective, okay, Dorothy, stick your head back in the sand, just pretend these things aren't going on, and da-da-da-da-da. And it's like, bitch, you're yelling at the internet. Nothing's going on.
You're yelling at the internet.
But you can just see these people, sitting there at their keyboards, fist clenched, knuckles turning like roller coaster pale white, just freaking out, frothing their blood pressure is probably like, 160 over 100 or 120 or whatever right now. And they're just freaking out, egging on that stroke or heart attack about all this shit. But here's my point. Here's the safe space thing. People need to unplug from that. We want to be a place people can go and not be bombarded with more of that shit. And that's been my other challenge to people. As I said, first of all, find me the people who need me to give them an opinion. And then secondly, I want you to do this. I want you then to show me that there is a view I need to express because it's not already being expressed somewhere else very loud in public. People don't need me to find reasons to have an opinion on Trump any direction you want to go. Totally love, totally hate, anywhere in the middle, whatever. I don't care. Whatever it is. Somebody on the internet that's easy to find is going to tell you that opinion and support it. You don't need me. What people need from me is they need somewhere to go where everything's chill. We can have a convention where a far left, multiracial trans woman can sit down across a table from a guy who's very conservative, very Christian, ex-Marine, and the two of them can sit there and enjoy each other's company, talking about throwing dice and the games they like and the sessions they've been in and the experiences they've had. People talk about this country's so divided. Well, here's an idea, asshole. Stop dividing it.
All right, Dan. I do have one important question. This is for the Fear the Boot listeners and not for the Why We Game listeners, although I hope there's some overlap. When do we get a BattleTech actual play? Number one. And number two, what is the basic elevator pitch of that campaign? Now, normally I would not want to invoke the new shiny when we're still playing Skies of Glass, but it's grinding down.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned a couple times that you want to do a BattleTech AP. And BattleTech is the game system and the game universe at which you probably seem to talk about the most. So when does this happen?
That will be either the next AP or the following AP. There's some internal debate on whether the next AP will be the other homebrew I have, which is a far future sci-fi one. Actually, Chad is one of the big pushers for. So if it is not the next campaign, which it might be once this is an ongoing debate, it'll be the campaign after that. So it's either campaign number 2 or campaign number 3. I think some of that may also come down to, before we start getting people excited about a new idea, while we have made good progress with getting SOG into beta forms and such, we're not where I'd like to be. So I may need some time to keep perfecting that before I take on a second creative project. So that may force Battletech to be AP number 2, but it'll be one of those. And the elevator pitch, I have one, but I don't know how much people are going to buy into this, which is the story that I've tried on several occasions to tell, but it's never gotten past a game or two, is something of a revenge story where, so to tell you a quick rundown of Battletech history, I'll keep this very, very quick, because Battletech history is complicated. I mean, it's about as complicated as real world history. So you had the major settled part of the galaxy that was ruled at one point in time by a single empire that had its own standing. It was totally feudal. And this was the king and the king's army. And there was a series of attacks from parts of the galaxy that did not belong to this kingdom that weakened it. And while the army was off dealing with that, a guy assassinated what we'll call the king, okay? That's not his actual title, but whatever. And wiped out his family line, so there was no successor left. And when the army got back, they were able to defeat the usurper. But once again, feudal system, the feudal lords who had their own armies, then were like, well, the king's dead. His family's dead. So one by one, they started declaring themselves the successors to his throne. And so they took to fighting, and he decided, he being the head of the army, decided, you know what, I'm not going to get involved in this. We're going to ditch this area, let it work itself out, and when they need us most, we will come back. And so they went off, and they had their own problems, and out of that came what in Battletech is called the clans, which is a high-tech society that I don't think should be high-tech, and I have my own opinions on why, but I'm not going to get into it.
The clans are a great divider of fans.
Yeah,
sure.
They are. Yeah. They absolutely are. They came back, and instead of trying to rehabilitate the galaxy, they instead opted to attack it. And they carved up a good chunk of it before they were finally stopped by another high-tech military that had been hiding within the galaxy. It's a long story. But they got stopped and then eventually took to infighting amongst themselves. But there's a lot of messed up things about their society. There's a lot of cruelty they enact upon each other, and a lot of cruelty they enact upon the people that they rule over. The story that I want to tell is about a group that was mercenaries who got overrun by the clans, lost a lot to them, and now basically have a personal vendetta, and someone has come along to basically fund you as an insurgency and tell that story. I've gotten some pushback from 1 or 2 players on this, so that's what I want to run. But I think there's a good chance we may end up doing something much more simple, like a more typical contract-based mercenary game, which does have its own form of ongoing unifying story, but it's a bit more, obviously, more character-driven than plot-driven. It's going to be one of those two. I'd be surprised if they pick like house regulars. I think they're going to probably pick either mercenaries or to go with the revenge story I want to tell.
If someone out there for some reason has not heard of the Fear the Boot podcast, where do we find Fear the Boot?
You can find everything we do at Fear the Boot, like be afraid of a shoe, feartheboot.com. And no weird spellings, no hyphens, no nothing. The actual play, I believe, is linked off that site via banner ads. If it's not, just drop the W's off the front of that. So it's on www.feartheboot.com. It is AP for actual play, so just AP.feartheboot.com. But I think there are ads for the actual play on the main site. If you want to find any of our social media stuff, once again, feartheboot.com. there is a drop-down list in the upper right of the site that says where to find us, and that lists everything. So if you want to find our Twitter feed, our Facebook group, our Discord server, if you want to find us on Spotify, Pandora, iTunes, all that stuff, where you can find all that in that drop-down, Google Podcasts, which is a subpart of Google Play or whatever, all that stuff's linked there. So anywhere you want to find us.
Well, Dan Repperger, thank you so much for your time, man. It was really cool hanging out with you today.
Well, you're quite welcome, Michael Brodor. I enjoyed I enjoyed being on. Thank you for having me. It was an honor to be here. And
as Dan says, we will catch you next time.
See you.
Why We Game is a production of the Influence Foundation. All rights reserved. Audio editing by Brodor. Music by Owen Godwin.